From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Friday, May 8th, 2015. A federal judge has just ruled that Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act cannot be used to justify the NSA's mass surveillance. We'll turn to Shahid Buttar of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee to discuss what could potentially be a huge victory for privacy rights. And Caroline Fredrickson will join us to discuss her new book, Under the Bus: How Working Women Are Being Run Over. We'll explore the ongoing wage disparity between women and men, why women are disproportionately represented in low-wage and tipped industries, and what some solutions to the problems are. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan, sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iran and in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
Elections in the UK yesterday yielded very surprising results, with incumbent Prime Minister David Cameron's Conservative Party winning a narrow majority in Parliament in a race that was expected to be far closer than it turned out. The other major party in Britain, the Labour Party, suffered a stinging loss, as did the traditional third party, the Liberal Democrats. The Scottish Nationalist Party, whose main agenda is separation from Britain, won 58 out of 59 seats, catapulting them into a strong position alongside the staunchly anti-separation Conservatives. Because Cameron's party has won at least 325 out of 650 seats, an overall majority, it does not need to form a coalition. The leader of the anti-immigrant UK Independence Party, Nigel Farage, lost his seat, and his party overall won only a single seat despite widespread media coverage. Rahul, what do you make of these results, so far off from predictions? Even 538.com's Nate Silver didn't see this much of a Conservative Party victory coming.
Well, it's really difficult to know what to make of it, and what one should interpret these results in the context that Britain's first past the post system means that very small swings in actual vote share can lead to very substantial swings in the number of seats. So, for example, although the SNP basically took seats away from Labour, it's quite possible that the entire Scottish independence campaign slightly damaged Labour's brand at a national level, which caused it to lose votes in heavily contested areas. I think it's also the case that this shows that either austerity is not biting England quite as hard as all the news reports seem to suggest, or that it is biting hard, and it's simply that Labour is not seen as an alternative. I think we also have to add in the lower than expected results for UKIP, which helped the Tories, certainly, because they would have been taking votes away from them. Overall, it's very hard to know at this point exactly what to make of those results.
And we will do a follow-up on this story. The U.S. Senate just passed a near-unanimous yes vote on a bill to oversee any nuclear agreement that the Obama administration makes with Iran. Obama has said he would sign the bill if it passed the House too, which it is likely to. If the bill passes, it will allow Congress to reject a future deal with Iran. However, Obama would likely veto their objection, which would mean lawmakers would have to return with a veto-proof majority to override him anyway. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act offers the best chance for our constituents through the Congress they elect to weigh in on the White House negotiations with Iran, and make no mistake, they need to have that opportunity. Rahul, how bizarre is this bill? Is this just another bald-faced attempt to sabotage one of the few constructive foreign policies of the Obama administration?
Well, this is a very weird bill, and I would count this vote as a huge victory for Tom Cotton, despite the fact that he was the one person in the Senate opposing it. He's somehow managed to gain a great deal of mileage out of an assertion of what ought to be Congress's fairly well-known right, Senate's well-known right to perform advise and consent on treaties. So it's a little bit unclear how much further this legislation is supposed to take that notion, but the fact that it won near unanimous support suggests two things. One is that it's hard for Democrats to go against the overall notion of congressional oversight of presidential foreign policy decisions, and the other is that in fact there are quite a few Democrats who are not as prepared as Obama to go out on this much of a limb with Iran. So overall, a victory for the extreme conservatives.
And finally, the U.S. Department of Labor released its monthly jobs report today, showing that the month of April saw 223,000 jobs added to the economy. That brings the official unemployment rate to 5.4%. The unofficial rate is, of course, higher. What have not improved are wage gains, with a paltry 0.1% increase in hourly pay, leading to the New York Times to conclude that, quote, any meaningful wage gains for most workers will have to wait. Meanwhile, President Obama visited the headquarters of Nike Corporation today in Portland, Oregon, as part of his aggressive campaigning for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a controversial trade deal. Nike claims that passage of the TPP would mean 10,000 new U.S. jobs at Nike, despite the fact that the trade deal would mean a lowering of barriers for major corporations to move manufacturing overseas. Somehow the TPP, according to Obama and Nike, will keep jobs in the U.S. Of the 1 million workers that Nike currently employs directly and indirectly, only 26,000 are based in the U.S. Rahul, do you buy the Nike promise to create 10,000 U.S. jobs? And we're just lost our connection with Rahul, and we're going to try to get him back on to answer that question. Rahul, all right, we're going to try to bring him back on. Do bear with us. We're having some problems with our connection to Rahul Mahajan. And so the story, oh, there he is. Do you buy this promise?
Well, I don't buy promises from corporations in general, but I don't think that the effect on jobs in the United States is really going to be very substantial or should be the primary focus. The TPP's biggest problems are actually the IPR provisions, intellectual property rights, which may actually harm abilities to deal with public health in other countries, and the investor-state dispute resolution, which will be another sort of codification of corporate rights over democratic processes.
Rahul, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
See you then.
Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. A 3-judge federal appeals panel in New York just ruled that the USA Patriot Act does not authorize the NSA's mass surveillance program, as both President Obama and George W. Bush have long maintained. The ruling is the result of a lawsuit brought by the ACLU based on privacy violations. Earlier, a lower court had ruled the program constitutional, but the ACLU appealed, leading to yesterday's victory for civil liberties. Section 215 of the Patriot Act expires next month, and Congress is debating on whether or not to extend it. The House Judiciary Committee a week ago passed a bill overhauling the USA Patriot Act. The bill would curb the sweeping up of metadata by the NSA and end the Orwellian practice by the FBI of sending national security letters and afford limited oversight of the secret FISA courts. The bill has bipartisan support and heads to the House for full vote, where it is likely to pass. Even in the Senate, a similar bill is gaining traction. But hardliners like Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell are intent on keeping the Patriot Act intact. McConnell may be fighting a losing battle. My guest is Shahid Buttar, Executive Director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. Welcome to Uprising, Shahid. So the federal panel ruled at the same time as a legislative battle over Section 215 of the Patriot Act is playing out. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how important the particular ruling is. So Congress on the one hand is getting ready to overhaul this very, very draconian law, a part of which has been used to justify NSA spying, and then on the other hand, this court ruling took place. How important is this ruling?
This ruling is incredibly important. Just to make one point very clear, it only addresses one particular basis for mass surveillance, and that's Section 215 of the Patriot Act. The NSA's mass surveillance activities also implicate other laws that neither the ruling nor, at the moment, the congressional debate are touching, and that's particularly the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which enables the internet spying programs, that Edward Snowden disclosed, like XT Score, Bull Run, Prism. None of that is covered either in the ruling or, which is unfortunate and there's not much you can do about, or in Congress, where it's even more unfortunate and there's a great deal that anyone can do about it. And Congress's failure to address the whole is disappointing, but the ruling does certainly push the ball with respect to this very important piece.
Now, can you give us some history on Section 215? For years, we were told there was a secret interpretation of one of the sections of the Patriot Act to justify mass surveillance. Then a few years ago, a leak from a FISA court order revealed that it was Section 215 that was being interpreted. The Obama administration finally admitted. What does this section actually say?
Well, so it's known as the business records provision, or alternatively, some people call it the library records provision. And it entitles the government to get any tangible thing, and here's where it gets crucially important, anything relevant to a counterterrorism investigation. And the way the Second Circuit, that is the court that ruled yesterday, described the government's construction of that standard, they said that the government is claiming that all telephone records are relevant to all international terrorism investigations, which is obviously preposterous, and the standard of relevance has been stretched beyond its rational limit. And this is true across the board. The agencies also contort the meaning of collect to evade and circumvent legal limits. They contort the meaning of search to evade constitutional limits. And what was interesting also about yesterday's decision is it wasn't a constitutional case. The judges didn't even have to reach whether or not mass surveillance is constitutional, which it is not, despite what the agencies contort the prior cases to suggest. What the court found was that what the Congress did in enacting the Patriot Act does not justify, as the authors of the Patriot Act themselves have said, the way that the NSA has used Section 215 to create a bulk surveillance system of telephone metadata.
And I understand that even the FISA court did not approve of the way Section 215 was being implemented, right? Or interpreted, rather.
At least in some cases. Generally, unfortunately, the FISA court has been a rubber stamp with respect to Section 215. In fact, the very first of the Snowden disclosures was the first of the FISA court orders that anyone had seen. In that particular document authorized the mass surveillance of hundreds of millions of Verizon business customers, including the organization I lead, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, which is why we're one among, I think the number is about 20 organizational plaintiffs suing the NSA, represented by the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Now, if the congressional discussions around Section 215 are happening at the same time, what's the likelihood that this legal ruling could influence them?
It should influence them enormously. And, it's a measure of Congress's failure, fecklessness, uselessness, spinelessness, insert adjective here, that quite frankly it hasn't it can entirely transform the debate. And just to make it this clear, I believe it was Senator Reid yesterday who suggested that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, and the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, this is Richard Burr, Republican from North Carolina, while many Republicans happen to be very concerned about privacy and some of the leading voices in Congress, these particular establishment Republican leaders, according to Senator Reid, are trying to reauthorize a program that was just held illegal. And that's exactly what they're doing. They want to reauthorize and extend Section 215 without any of the proposed reforms, which is insane. Not only has this provision proven ineffective, as multiple independent, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Board, the President's own review board, the 9/11 Commission, all these groups have established that mass surveillance is not the remedy, and Senators McConnell and Burr are more concerned with reciting CIA talking points than they are about taking heed this ruling by a court saying that without even reaching the issue of rights, this very permissive, I dare say, authoritarian law passed 12 years ago, even that does not permit what Congress is doing now. And I do just want to note that while the court failed to reach the broader issues because the facts presented didn't raise them, Congress can absolutely, if pressed by its constituents, engage the issues beyond Section 215. There's no reason that Congress should not enact the Surveillance State Repeal Act. This is H.R. 1466, bipartisan co-sponsorship, and it would rescind the entire Patriot Act and the 2008 law that made it worse. And we, the people of the United States, should absolutely be very vocal at this particular time to let the court blow wind in our sails rather than shut us up and lock us in our own homes.
So the Surveillance State Repeal Act is the name of that law?
That's the name of the bill. It's been introduced by Representative Mark Pocan from Madison, Wisconsin, and Thomas Massey, Republican from Kentucky. And the bipartisan allegiance between populists, constitutionalists on both the left, the progressive left, and the libertarian right in Congress is exactly what, a lot of us have been looking for this for a long time, fanning that particular flame and trying to essentially challenge the bipartisan establishment by organizing resistance that brings together the wings of the political spectrum. And I see that happening in this bill. What this ruling says, essentially, is that the bipartisan establishment debate in Congress is so much hot air. And they're debating, essentially, whether to extend an illegal law, when what they should be debating is whether or not to repeal the entirety of the rest of it, which, if ever subject to legal challenge, would quite likely suffer the same fate as Section 215. One thing that the Second Circuit said, very importantly, was that the government's reasoning in this case had no limiting principle. And that particular criticism would apply not only to the government's construction of its powers under Section 215, but also all the other enabling laws I mentioned before, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Executive Order 12333, all of those reflect the same lack of a limiting principle.
And let's also remind our audience again, as you did earlier, that we're talking here just about the NSA's surveillance of telephone metadata, not the entire gamut of and spectrum of surveillance, particularly internet surveillance that we suffer. Now, much of the current state of affairs with the USA Patriot Act is something that came about after the 9/11 attacks, when hysteria over terrorism was still fresh. Many members of Congress who voted on the USA Patriot Act hadn't even read it. And recently, the Texas attack at the controversial Pamela Geller Prophet Muhammad drawing contest event, where two armed attackers killed a guard and were then killed themselves, that's raised similar questions. And of course, we have the sentencing phase of the Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, happening right now. And we are told over and over again the threat of terrorism is why we need such surveillance in place. Are such events blown out of proportion to justify mass spying?
At the very least, I mean, I dare say the implications of those events is twisted on its head. The fact that they happen is itself proof that mass surveillance doesn't work, right? I mean, we are already tapping the internet and the phone system. If that worked to ensure security, there wouldn't have been an attack. Any of those attacks, there wouldn't have been attacks at Fort Hood. The Sikh Gurudwara in Oak Creek wouldn't have been shot. All the mass shootings would have been prevented. There wouldn't be any of the incidents that people have been concerned about. But the fact of the matter, and this is unfortunate for people concerned about their security, but mass surveillance doesn't get it. Nor is it constitutional, and it undermines freedom of thought and everything else. I mean, even if you just look at it through a security lens, mass surveillance isn't the solution. And this shouldn't surprise anyone. I mean, this was actually what the 9/11 Commission told us over a decade ago. Its finding, when Congress basically finished the investigation that the Patriot Act preceded, when they finished the investigation, its principal finding was that the 9/11 attacks were enabled by intelligence failures by the agencies related to data analysis and sharing, not collection. They had all the dots. And what Congress has spent the last 15 years doing is expanding the sphere of dot collection, fixing a problem that was not a problem, and in fact creating much worse problems for our democracy.
Finally, Shahid, there has been a lot of grassroots organizing against mass surveillance. An innovative form of fighting back this week was led by an international group called Transparency Toolkit, that used a very innovative way to create a massive public database of individuals who are contracted by the NSA. They used publicly available resume and job search data from sites like LinkedIn to create the searchable database called IC Watch. They've just presented it at a conference in Berlin this week. And IC Watch features the resumes and details of 27,000 NSA contractors. And they're basically saying, journalists and activists can make use of this to shed more light on the ways in which we are surveilled. Any ideas for how an enterprising activist or journalist could use it? And also, what do you make of it?
I think it's fascinating. It reflects a civil society response to a policy process that has essentially failed. and is revealing its corruption in 2 years of exposure of mass surveillance without any meaningful reforms having yet been enacted. And I think these are the kinds of civil society responses we'd want to see. I'm generally a privacy advocate. I would say that if you're going to engage in the business of mass surveillance, it is at least ironic for one's own information to become transparent to the public, and there might be some poetic justice there. And the last thing I'd say is that while we might talk about court rulings and talk about Congress, at the end of the day, and all of those actors in both the courts and Congress will say this themselves, it is about us, we the people. The courts look to reasonable expectations of privacy, and the way they determine what they are is looking at civil society. Congress does what its constituents require it to, and what we basically raise our voices to force it to do. And so it's ultimately our decision whether or not mass surveillance will continue, and these kinds of responses reaching whatever tools are available to us. The Edward Snowden statue in Fort Greene Park in New York. I've seen some interesting stickers up around town promoting Fighting 215. The music video I put together last year, NSA versus USA. I think these are all examples of people raising our voices through whatever means we have available to us, and I think that ultimately, whatever we might hear from Washington, that is the way out of this mess and to restore our constitutional rights.
And we'll post a link to your video, NSA versus USA, at uprisingwithsonali.com later today. Shahid, thanks as always for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on. Keep up the great work.
Thanks. My guest, Shahid Buttar, is the Executive Director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, joining us from Washington, D.C., where he was sitting outside so we could hear the sound of the birds. And this is Uprising. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. A new United Nations report has found that women worldwide earn significantly less than men, even though they're working longer hours. Despite the growing visibility of women in higher tiers of the corporate world, by and large, women are nowhere close to achieving wage parity. Here in the United States, women are ranked 65th in wage parity as raised by presidential candidate Hillary Clinton in her recent address to the Women in the World Summit in New York City. Now, Caroline Fredrickson, president of the American Constitution Society, details the myriad ways in which women are being thrown, quote, under the bus, which is actually the title of her new book. Caroline Fredrickson is also a senior fellow at Demos and has written about many important constitutional issues. She's also the former director of the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office and was general counsel and legal director of NARAL Pro-Choice America. Welcome to Uprising, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Sonali. It's a pleasure to be on.
Now, broadly speaking, I suppose we shouldn't at all be surprised at the global state of women's workplace inequality. It's this concrete measure of historical sexism that's been around probably as long as our species has, right?
Well, it's hard to know actually how much has been around since the beginning and how much we've just seen happen through culture and discrimination and so forth. So I always hesitate to sort of agree to that kind of a scenario because it makes it sound almost like it's a natural occurrence and that it's built into the genders.
Right. Now, your book focuses primarily on women in the U.S. and as the world's supposedly most wealthy and advanced nation, a beacon for democracy and equality, is it all the more shocking given how low we rank on a global scale for things like women's wages? And in fact, where are we on the global scale?
Well, I think it's very true. We are not nearly as high as we'd like to think we are. And I think it surprised me, actually, when I started looking into some of the issues. We have a number of reasons why we don't rank as high. One is that we don't do anything in terms of childcare, really. We have the most minimal provisions for women, lower income women, but only 18% of eligible children even qualify for what our government provides. That's a vast majority of those children who are even in that low income level who can't get in, which affects their mothers very deeply in terms of what kind of jobs they can have, what kind of training and education. And then, of course, we don't have paid family leave, except for the very few, the very lucky, the upper levels of income, and mostly white women, honestly. And actually, men are the ones who most benefit from paid family leave, which is the irony. But then beyond that, in terms of wages, we do we have not addressed some very important issues of the statutory framework that we have. And this is where I was sort of most surprised, that we think we have this great set of laws that protects women against discrimination, that provides a minimum wage and overtime. But in fact, there are large groups of women who are not protected by those laws. And that leads to a lot of perverse outcomes, such as women who are in domestic work getting worked far more hours than they should be, not making any overtime, not even making a minimum wage, at least not as required by law. And so you have these groups of women who are really falling behind, and no surprise, they tend to be women of color, and many of them are immigrant women.
You open your book telling the story of your own grandmother, a poor immigrant woman, and it's easy to sort of lose ourselves in the statistics. But tell us a little bit about that story and why it was sort of a personal inspiration for you.
Well, it was actually it was my great grandmother came from Sweden, and she was came on her own in her teens, very, very poor. And, I just think it's a story that is very true for a lot of Americans. When we lose sight of that, we lose sight of the fact that there are more and more people coming in who still face these same situations, and particularly for the domestic workers. And my great-grandmother worked in a fancy, rich people's house in Boston. She was a scullery maid, kind of the lowest level of person in the kitchen. She didn't speak any English. And people say to me, well, doesn't that show you that the American dream is still true, and that, why do we need all this government help when your own story tells that people can move forward? Well, I have a few answers to that. One is, well, my great-grandparents were all white. They were all Northern European. They were all Protestant. But also the thing that people forget is that my great-grandfather was a working man. And when my great-grandmother met my great-grandfather, he was a Teamster. And there were actually ways that people could have decent paying jobs even without being educated, and really move themselves up in the world. Those jobs don't exist anymore. Our union movement has fallen apart. And I think it's actually an example of why some people were able to rise at a certain point in time. And we don't have that structure. It's one reason why I talk about unions in my book, because I think they have been such an important part of helping working families, and particularly women, better their situations. But they are just so weakened now by the continued onslaught from the right. And I certainly think it should be a major focus of policies to figure out how to improve people's access to organizing.
So on the issue of unions, we know that there's a strong correlation between union representation and overall wages being higher for those people who are unionized. But what about wage parity? Do women represented by a union tend to have wages that are more equal to the men in that union? Or do we know that data?
Absolutely. No, it's absolutely women who are in organized jobs who have a union have much closer wage parity. Not only that, but they have much better benefits. They have much more flexibility in their schedules, much more likely to have paid leave. So in all of the variables that we talked about before about why it is that American women don't rate as high as women in many other countries in the world because of the policies that we follow in the United States, unions are the counter to that. If more women were unionized, we would actually rank much higher.
Now, how disproportionately represented are women in not just low-wage industries, but also tipped industries? On our program, we had had a real close look at how tipped workers are being thrown under the bus, to paraphrase your book title, even compared to other low-wage workers in the fight for a higher minimum wage. But it's often, or it's a majority women, I understand, that are part of the tipped workforce.
Absolutely, more than a majority. It's almost 3/4. And most of those workers are in the restaurant industry, which is not surprising, but they're also, they work at hair salons and manicurists and so forth. And the ugly reality is that we haven't raised the tip minimum wage since the early 1990s. It's $2.13 an hour. I mean, people don't even seem to realize that. And when I tell them that, it just produces this look of incredible surprise that somehow that could be the wage that anyone in the United States would make. But we forget that. And I think many people forget that when they go out to eat and they go to a restaurant. But particularly if you're in one of where most of the women dominate is in these sort of casual restaurants. It's a macaroni grill or a place like that. People don't really think about leaving a tip, but we shouldn't actually expect these workers to have to, depend on, people feeling particularly generous that day. The idea that there's not just a base minimum wage for all workers, and in fact, it should be much higher, uh, far more higher than it is, and that's why I'm very taken by the fight for 15. But even if we can get to 12, that'll bring people up somewhat. But we cannot leave the tipped workers behind.
Because that's leaving women behind.
It's absolutely
Now,
leaving women behind.
what about, you mentioned manicurists. The New York Times recently had this lengthy expose on the nail industry in New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The reporter Sarah Maslanier found that, quote, among the more than 100 workers interviewed by the Times, and this is of the workers in New York that she interviewed, only about a quarter said that they were paid an amount that was the equivalent of New York State's minimum hourly wage. All but 3 workers, however, had wages withheld in other ways that would be considered illegal, such as never getting overtime. I'm guessing you're not very surprised by these findings.
I'm not, and most of them aren't even entitled to overtime. It just happens to be, different examples. But if you work for a small business, or your particular independent contractors, a lot of manicurists and hair women who work at hair salons are actually treated as independent contractors, so they're not even guaranteed overtime. I think New York is more protective in that regard. But that is absolutely common. One of the big problems with the tipped minimum wage is that the enforcement is very complicated, because what has to happen in theory is that a worker is entitled to a minimum wage. But with tipped workers, what we're assuming is that somehow the tips that they get will bring them up to the minimum wage. Whereas sometimes you have employers, restaurants that will say, oh, you actually made more than the minimum wage, so we're going to withhold some of your pay because you shouldn't make more than the minimum wage. But in fact, there are many, many occasions, and there have been a lot of lawsuits that document this, not enough, unfortunately, because so many women are not being paid their wages, but that show that it is certainly a good bet for companies not to sort of fill in above the tipped employee to the minimum wage level, because it's so hard to enforce that almost always the employer is going to be getting work at almost slave labor prices.
Right. And of course, many, many women, perhaps the majority in, for example, the nail industry, which we were just talking about, are also immigrant women. How are particularly undocumented women in the country faring in terms of wages? They have that added layer of vulnerability of being undocumented.
No, absolutely right. It's really complicated. Because for many women, it's not just that they're afraid, because if they bring issues forward that they might lose their jobs, which they depend on so desperately, and they might, in fact, lose their, if they're undocumented, they might come and be turned over to to ICE for deportation. But there are also laws, some of our so-called protective laws actually do not provide protections to undocumented workers at all. And so even were they to come forward, there would be no protection for them. So it is really a completely perverse system, that we should recognize that workers have rights and keep our immigration questions and enforcement issues in terms of our border separate from worker protections, because if you don't, and if they start to mix, then all of a sudden we get these very perverse incentives where employers really have workers over a barrel. They'll hire undocumented workers, and then they can threaten to deport them if an undocumented worker dares to raise issues about not being paid a minimum wage or getting overtime. And one area where this really plays out is in sexual harassment. And particularly for immigrant women, they work in a lot of types of jobs like farm work, domestic work, where they are highly subject to sexual harassment. And the obvious problem is they're not protected by the law, and they're highly dependent on their employer. And there have been some really, really heartbreaking reports documenting the types of sexual assault and even rape that happen to women with really no recourse.
Now, Caroline, we just talked about tipped workers. There's also temp workers. And in your book, you talk about the rise of the permanent temp. How serious a problem is this and how vulnerable are women workers when they're essentially just kept on temporarily, indefinitely?
Well, this is an issue that I hope we can build common cause across genders and race, because this is the issue of now and of the future. The rise of the temp workers is a phenomenon in which more and more companies are hiring temps when they have maybe a decent, at least decently paid workforce, and they start creating a two-tier workforce, and they bring on temps through temp agencies that hire them at lower wages and lower benefits. And this has happened with some of the big car companies in the South. Nissan is somewhat infamous for having the majority of its workers in Tennessee are actually temp workers. And so what it does, it bifurcates the workforce, but not just in terms of wages, but also in terms of general protections for workers, because temp workers are also, and this is really, as you can see, it's a major theme of my book, but the exemptions that we have in our laws allow employers to really manipulate the status of employees, and that's whether you're called an independent contractor or a temp worker or a part-time worker, that those kinds of designations really allow the employer to reduce the number of workers they have to protect against discrimination, that they have to provide minimum wage to, or overtime, or that are allowed to even join a union. And so women are obviously, we are the ones who are most vulnerable. And so this group of temp workers there are very many women. And I think, but we really need to wrestle with this in the United States, because this is a pattern and a paradigm that more employers are adopting, and more and more men are going to be affected by this.
And actually, on this issue of men versus women, how do you respond to those who might say, well, all workers are suffering in this economy, that we should be fighting for all workers' rights? Why are you just pointing out the fact that women workers are being screwed over, thrown under the bus?
Well, exactly. And I pointed out because, as I said, I think women are the canary in the coal mine. Women have experienced more quickly and more deeply the types of fragmentations in our workplace that are now becoming more and more mainstream. And so I raise this because the kinds of exemptions that have affected women, including categories of workers who are left out of our labor protections, those kinds of jobs are the jobs that are becoming more and more prevalent in the American economy. So a lot of service jobs are the ones that the Department of Labor has identified as the fastest growing and the ones that are likely to have the most number of employees going forward. So, I think that looking out for women, who are, by the way, the 51%. So I think when you start caring about women workers, you are actually caring about the majority of workers. But really, these types of trends are expanding. And employers are exploiting them. And so, I really think it's an opportunity, through calling attention to sort of the origins of many of these holes in our labor protections, which come out of a history of racism and misogyny. But looking at that and then sort of seeing where it goes, you see more and more employers taking advantage of these kinds of loopholes that were created initially during the New Deal to make sure that African Americans living in the South couldn't take advantage of the right to organize or get a minimum wage.
Caroline Fredrickson is my guest, and we're talking about her book, Under the Bus, How Working Women Are Being Run Over. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I want to discuss some of the corporate responses to women's conditions in the workplace. We've heard of leaning in or opting out. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. We turn back to our guest, Caroline Fredrickson. She's the president of the American Constitution Society. Her new book is called Under the Bus: How Working Women Are Being Run Over. Caroline, let's talk about the corporate response to the crisis of women who are working and getting thrown under the bus. It's best exemplified by Facebook executive Sheryl Sandberg, whose 2013 book, Lean In, asserted that it's, women's fault if they're getting left behind in the economy, and if they only leaned in and acted maybe more like men and became more aggressive, they would do better. Now, as you can tell, I sort of detest this patronizing approach. What is your response?
Well, so I do think there are some issues that Sheryl Sandberg raises that we should encourage more conversation about in a broader sense of the kind of cultural constraints that women grow up with. I think the way that women are discouraged from succeeding, from being smart, the whole something I was always sensitive to as a kid, but the dumb blonde kind of perspective that women are labeled with if they whether they try to be smart or they hide their intelligence. But there are certainly, so I give her credit for putting that out there. But when she and the conversation that was going on between her and Anne-Marie Slaughter, in some sense, I think it was a conversation in the sense that people were hearing the lean in message, and then there was a counter message called the opt out message, which
Right.
Anne-Marie Slaughter sort of exemplified about how for women, this was high striving women could not be both successful in the workplace and have a successful home life. And what just really frustrated me about the conversation was that there was so much taken for granted, and that was all women are upper middle class white women with a graduate degree in some kind of profession who are married and have children and are trying to figure out how to, how many nannies they should hire and how they should deal with the house cleaner. As well as, as Sheryl Sandberg, I really do feel terrible for her with her loss of her husband.
Yes, of course.
What she does say is how important it is to have a partner who is supportive of you. And I fully endorse that viewpoint. And I'm very sorry for her loss. But
her husband just recently passed away in a freak accident. Yeah. Well, and actually, the point, of course, is that women who want to be mothers, even it seems as in the upper middle class to the 1%ers, are essentially being forced to stay at home or choosing, in this case, opting out to stay at home because they can afford to. They might have husbands or be independently wealthy. But we started our conversations talking about how such a huge reason why women are really being hurt in this economy is because of the lack of support for many women who want to be mothers. There's almost no maternity leave that's required, depending on the state you live in. Childcare is so unaffordable. So can you focus on that a little bit and how those women who might have the option of opting out rarely have to worry about this?
Well, thank you, Sonali, for that question. And one of the things that I was really amazed by in doing the research for Under the Bus was looking into the history of childcare in our country. And one of the issues around motherhood that is really so interesting and probably won't take any of the listeners by surprise because it's so intuitively obvious. But, we have a really, I would say, hypocritical view of motherhood in this country in that we have very much celebrated the stay-at-home mom, the kind of traditional woman wearing an apron and baking pies, who's there for her 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 kids. But that woman and that mother is a white woman, and father knows best, the Mayberry, you think of all those kind of classic American TV shows. But we've had another view of motherhood that has affected low-wage women of color, and that is this kind of welfare queen, lazy women, and the whole welfare reform effort that was really structured to push women into the workplace, even if they were a single mom, even if they had very young kids, even without providing them with training, with support, with support to pay for transportation to a job, and all of those things. And we've kind of maintained this duality in our perception of women, and that has played into the childcare issue in the United States because we did experiment with childcare during World War II. It was a very small program. It was poorly run and underfunded, and it was only put in place because those kind of women, those mothers, white mothers, were in the factories because we needed it for the war effort. And so it was still not celebrated. Rosie the Riveter, by the way, doesn't seem like she was a mom, because all of the conversation about mothers at the time was really about how mothers shouldn't be working unless they really had to. Women need to be in the workforce, but mothers preferably not. So there was this very small program which was immediately dissolved at the end of World War II, and men came back, and women were pushed out of those factory jobs and back into low-paid jobs if they were in the workforce at all. And then there was another experiment, and this was so fascinating. In the 70s, there was an effort to establish a child care expansion that would have included more than Head Start includes, to have a broader base of families, and really, sort of up into middle income families who would have been able to benefit from starting to create a kind of extension of our public school system. But the same groups that organized to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment organized to defeat the child care law. Of course, right. And there was this group, and this is, it's sort of funny, except that the consequences are so tragic, but there was a group called the 4Ws, which meant women who want to be women. Literally, wow. This was, and they were active in the ERA fight, and they led the charge in getting President Nixon to veto the legislation. They described how these terrible feminists were going to be breaking down the family and taking their husbands away from them and perverting their children, and and all sorts of crazy things. But as a result, the women who really needed this help, women who can't opt out, and to go back to that conversation, the real needs for childcare are not for the women who struggle with, should I stay home or should I work? And it's a choice. What are the sort of cultural issues? And but it's for the women who really don't have a choice. I have no problems with women who want to stay home and raise their children at home. If that is really a choice, that's great. But what worries me a lot more is the women who don't have a choice at all, because they really they need the money. And when childcare is so phenomenally expensive in this country and so unavailable for low-income families, we have a real situation, because, as I looked into some of the data for Under the Bus, I looked at the Department of Labor data on childcare arrangements, and they have a whole category that's called self-care. So I'm sure I don't need to spell that out for the viewers what that means.
Self-care.
Yes, it's just, I could not believe the euphemism. When we're talking about leaving kids alone, it is a phenomenon that was documented at the beginning of the 20th century, when people used to chain their kids to tables so they could go off to the factories, because they couldn't really put them anywhere, and there wasn't accessible childcare. Well, we're still in that situation. People may not be chaining their kids to the table, but they don't have anywhere to put them if they can't find family members to take care of them. It's a desperate struggle to pay the extraordinary cost of childcare.
And essentially, then, does it become just motherhood, become a privilege, sort of saved for the rich, right? Either poor people or working poor people have children that end up being neglected because the economy forces them, or it ends up being rich people who get to have kids. I mean,
well, absolutely. It means that having a family is an incredible struggle for low-wage families. And you see, at some of the data about the cost of childcare shows that for even up into middle-income families, you're talking about a third or more of people's income going to childcare.
Oh yes, don't I know that?
Yeah, right. So, and childcare can cost as much as the tuition at a state university. And what kind of a situation a society do we have where we put so little value on the next generation, let alone on women's own ability to sort of fulfill their personal aspirations? But let's think about what happens to children when they're left in inadequate childcare. And again, the terrible stories about unregulated childcare or lack of childcare and the impact that it has on specific children. But the general trends are very clear, and the data shows that the outcomes are far worse for those children. And ultimately for our society. So even if people don't have, kind of ultimate empathy for these women and their families who are struggling. Hope everybody understands that the impact on our economy and the future of the United States is really at risk when we don't start factoring in the absolute value that we need to place on early childhood education, and on paid family leave.
Right. So, Caroline, in the last part of this interview, let's talk about, in broad strokes, how we got here and use that to illuminate how we can get out of here. I mean, is it the case that women tend to get opportunities primarily in low-wage industries, or that women's dominance of certain industries leads to low wages? So which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Well, I love that question because there is, I think what really puts the test to that is that there's a phenomenon called the glass escalator phenomenon, which has been documented that when men go into women-dominated professions like teaching or working in secretarial jobs, they very quickly move ahead and start making more money.
Wow.
So I think there are many other indicators, but the reality is that jobs that women do that are absolutely equal in terms of value, in terms of the types of skills, experience, education that people bring to the job, when those professions are dominated by women, they're paid less than the equally valued jobs paid by worked by men. It's clear that there's a sort of a gender issue at play, and I actually think it's discrimination. It may be indirect discrimination. But the fact that we've decided as a society that the jobs that women do, even though they require this, the same level of education and skills as the jobs that men do, we will not pay as much. That's a decision that we've made. It's not a decision that women have made. Hey, I'm going to take the lower paying job because I'd rather be in the lower paying job. In fact, what we've decided is that being a truck driver is more valuable than being a school teacher. But that's something I think we need to really reevaluate. In Europe, they have legislation that actually requires equal pay for work of equal value, not equal pay for the same job. I mean, that's obviously something that we are supposed to abide by in this country. But they are moving forward to deal with issues where our sort of societal gender bias has worked its way into how we value those kinds of jobs. And the other thing that I think is a significant factor is that a lot of the jobs that women do, nursing, school teaching, early child care, are sort of classic nurturing, caretaking jobs. And I think there is also that sort of bias that because that's somehow natural for women, it's not really a job, and it really shouldn't be valued at the same level as things that men do, which are real jobs. And I think we really need to take stock of that, because I can't imagine anything more important than good nursing and good childcare and good teaching. So as a society, again, I think we need to wrestle with the fact that we are undervaluing these jobs, and as a result, we're not getting the kinds of services and the kinds of outcomes that we really need as a society.
Now, earlier we talked about, you pointed out how in laws that are in place that are meant to protect workers, exemptions have been carved out over the years. Can you point to, or is it a matter of us identifying what those exemptions are and closing loopholes, or is there a larger fight at work here, such as, for example, making it legally easier for people to join unions?
Well, I think those things are go in sync, because one of the reasons why people can't join unions is not just because we've erected all sorts of barriers, just through practice, but because there's some groups of workers that are actually they're not prohibited from joining a union, but they're not. What the National Labor Relations Act actually does is it provides protections to workers who join a union against being fired. These workers can be fired for trying to organize themselves. So there is a huge role for closing the loopholes. But there are many broader issues, I think, that we need to address about, not just making sure that domestic workers and farm workers, temp workers and independent contractors, who are all, part-time workers, have kind of basic workplace rights. But we need to start thinking about, I think, very much broader types of solutions that will allow universal protections. For example, if we had single-payer health care instead of the Affordable Care Act, which is still still in advance, obviously, but having the Affordable Care Act allows people who are trying to prevent access to health care from having attacking the legislation through 1,000 different ways. they've tried to kill it every single way. Well, that's what happens with the way our workplace laws are structured, is that they are so keyed into certain types of workers with certain types of protections that they give an incredible amount of leverage to employers, and they have a lot of ability to manipulate the categories that workers fall into. Because guess what? If you're a temp, you don't get what a full-time a regular employee gets in terms of protections. And so it's in the employer's interest, certainly from a financial point of view, to try and make more workers fit that category as opposed to the other category. Which is not to say that all employers do this, but certainly when there's a competition and the bottom line is what's at stake, there's a lot of pressure to go in that direction.
Finally, Caroline, in the last minute of our program, many are placing their hope in electing a new female president. And Hillary Clinton, while she has spoken out on women's equality and the need for women's wage parity, is also deeply wedded to corporate America. Do you have any sense of what sort of a president she might be on wage parity? I mean, we should say President Obama took a big step on that, but has probably not done as much as he could have.
Well, I'm looking toward a broad transformation of this conversation, but I am somewhat hopeful because I think both President Obama and Hillary Clinton have started to raise issues about needing to have better access to affordable, quality health, childcare for all families, as well as to expand the Family and Medical Leave Act to make sure more workers are covered and that there's paid leave. Those are two issues that are extraordinarily important and will really help women and families and children and overall the American economy profoundly. So I'm hopeful that this is no longer a subject that's somehow relegated to women's issues, but is an important political topic.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for spending this time with us. Best of luck to you.
Thank you so much, Sonali.
My guest, Caroline Fredrickson, is president of the American Constitution Society, author of Under the Bus, How Working Women Are Being Run Over. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Bus is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscription sustains our TV show. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.